Hello and welcome to this short real talk video in which I put out some background gameplay. It's most likely going to be Elden Ring. In fact, I know it's going to be Elden Ring. It's going to be my third playthrough as I play as a Hex build, which is a hybrid faith and intelligence build, but my restriction to myself is that I just don't use the Sword of Nine Flame, even though it's been nerfed. So there's back in the other Dark Souls games, like 3 and 2, and somewhat 1, but not as much prevalent. There was Hex builds in which you go hybrid faith and intelligence, and you get dark magic abilities. Even though in Elden Ring you can get black fire with just faith, which is kind of interesting and kind of odd. But at least you get some death magic and some holy magic, interestingly enough, when you use the Hex hybrid. I'll just call it Hex, but I hope you enjoy the gameplay in the background. But let's get to the main meat and potatoes of this video. You may have noticed that I've been posting a lot of D&D on my channel, and that's one part because I love D&D, and having a place to record my D&D videos is just a nice place to be able to look back upon and have a great time and just laugh upon the great moments that we had together as friends, because a lot of them are IRL friends, and some I wish they became my IRL friends, to be completely honest. I wish I could meet a lot of the people that have played in my sessions. But that's the beauty of online plays, and you get to play with people all around the world, and we can play as something as intimate as D&D, where we just all make ourselves look silly in front of each other, role-playing and pretending stuff that we are definitely not. But overall, you may have noticed, since I said before, like I've been posting D&D, and there's been a severe lack of Warhammer content, specifically Warhammer 3. Now, I'll be completely honest with everybody listening to this video. Warhammer 3 is just not making me happy. I'm not very interested in the multiplayer right now, other than some very casual games with friends. Like I've been playing 2v2s with a Discord that's called like the Superior Persons Discord. I'll hop in there once in a while, watch some games, play, but I won't even play in their tournaments most of the time because, one, I've been busy with school and work, and two, I just spend my time playing other games that I think that are a little bit more fleshed out, like Elden Ring, perhaps, or maybe Fire Emblem Three Houses, or even Pokemon, if I'll completely honest. And I think Warhammer 3 lacks in its multiplayer right now because of a few really important things that need to be stated. I think the first thing is there's a lack of build variety, which I think can be fixed. The low unit roster, which is just a byproduct of being a new game being released and not many, so having so many rosters and so many factions at the release of the game, there's going to be some rosters that suffer for that, and that's very understandable. Unfortunately, that makes me lose interest in the game until those rosters get more fleshed out. And I think the biggest reason why I dislike Warhammer 3, and this is why at the end of Warhammer 2 I had a real big problem with the multiplayer as well, is because the power gap between strong units and weak units in a faction. If you guys notice, if you guys watch like Turin or Rubber Duck of War or any of the, or Dov Plays, any of the more multiplayer aficionados in the Warhammer community, you'll notice a lot of really powerful names haven't been showing up. You don't see Falcon playing too many games anymore. Really don't see, well, to be honest, you don't see a lot of XMT or Extreme Meme Team in general. You don't see Flying Taco. You don't see QSA members. You don't really see, or at least I don't see Aerocrastic playing Warhammer 3 anymore, or Warhammer in general. Maybe Hadri's. I don't see Soothsayer anymore. Soothsayer is gone. I think it's mostly dominated what's it called? The multiplayer scene is mostly dominated by ODM and RTK and what's the other one? ODM, RTK, and VM clan members. And you don't see what, like, the XMT QSA dominance that it used to be, and that's because I think a lot of the top players are just no longer interested. The biggest reason for me, at least, is because you the build variety and like building your armies is really not there anymore. I'll try to put some background footage of me putting a what I think is probably one of the most efficient corn builds, and I might do several footages of just different factions and their like optimal builds. But when I started playing Warhammer 2 multiplayer like competitively, it was like a vast jungle, like call it Lustria if you want to, of different attempts at making builds and different play styles that you could play per faction, which I thought was really cool. I think a great example of this is Empire. Empire, when I first started playing Warhammer 2, had many different subsets of builds. You could play as a Demigriff Rush with Karl Franz holding the lead, going in, charging, buffing all these Demigriffs. Very powerful. You can do a gun line with handgunners. You can try to attempt, well, this was just after like a buff to the war wagons, you could attempt to use these protected, very minuscule weapons teams with the war wagons, but they always get their value because you put all your effort into protecting them. You could try to do this Volkmar flagellant sort of almost like rush build where you put a little bit more gold into infantry, maybe even great swords, although they're just like okay swords now, right? And support them with cavalry and maybe just a few cheap archers. Like the build variety was more about the idea. Like you wanted to center your builds around an idea and push it forward, pushing your strengths, trying to minimize your weaknesses. But near the end of Warhammer 2 and at the start of Warhammer 3, builds became very monotonous, if I could say. Every single faction had like 1 to 2 builds that were extremely optimal, and you could play in essentially every single matchup. It was just boring. There was no build aspect to the game anymore. Something that I really, obviously I'm exaggerating. There is some build, like in maybe one matchup you'll bring an Ragnarok spider, and the other matchup it's 2 Ragnarok spiders, if that's even legal. That's not legal in most parts, I think. I don't know. It's been a while since I've been playing greenskins and their competitive rules, but overall, like you like the builds change like 1 or 2 units between matchups as they have slight niches, and you don't have actual set different almost like themes. Like if I wanted to play high elves competitively, actually I think a better example is dark elves. We all know our friend Ice Power Total War. I don't think he even is playing Warhammer 3 right now, and he's off having fun doing his music and things like that. So shout out to Ice Power, but we all know he's a great Dark Elf player. And we all know the meme, I hope you all know, the meme that Morathi Double Manticore and Scourge Runners was just about the only build Dark Elves could put on the field for the majority of Warhammer 2's lifetime and do anything competitively. So they had one build versus Greenskins, Morathi, Double Manticore, Scourge Runners. Versus Empire, Morathi, Double Manticore, Scourge Runners. Versus, I don't know, anybody. Lizardmen, Morathi, maybe not Double Manticore because Manticores aren't great against Lizardmen, Scourge Runners. And you just kind of see this theme over and over again. I think the Dark Elf Lizardman matchup is actually one of the more fun ones. So you can bring like the high costing melee cav that they have, which is pretty cool. But overall, you want to bring Scourge Runners, and every single matchup you bring the repeater crossbows on the mounted repeater crossbows, and it's the same build over and over again. And I really enjoyed the part of Warhammer where I would sit in the custom lobby battle and be like, oh, I want to make this unit work, or I want to make that unit work. And by the end of it, if you're not using the optimal build for like competitive play, you're just going to lose. Like, make all the excuses you want. Oh, my enemies is better than me, or I'm just worse than my enemy, or I just didn't make the unit work, which is absolutely valid. But if you just use the terrible units that are not the top of every faction, you really set yourself at a deficit. And that goes into my point of how the power gap between strong units and weak units in a faction is way too large. I think Warhammer 3 is a really good example of this. Warhammer 2 had its problems, but Warhammer 3 is just a huge showcase of why every strong unit in a faction is way better than the weaker units in the faction, and that leads to this meta of almost zero build variety. You can joke all about the memes and the silly, interesting builds that you find that on Turn's channel, Dov's channel, because the player is significantly better than the other one and get us away with it. But let's just look at Kislev. Kislev has these light war sleds that are so cost effective. If you are not bringing them in a competitive environment, you're just being stupid. It's not about like the builds anymore. It's or like theory crafting or trying to push forward interesting like combinations that the developers want you to try. Like, oh, maybe I want to try this sort of overwhelming firepower Kislev build. Well, yeah, the theme of Kislev is like everybody can shoot. Everybody's a hybrid build, so I want to do this super cool hybrid. Everybody shoots, and you're gonna compromise some parts of my ranged units, but if everyone's a ranged unit, you can't compromise them all, and they just defend each other. And it's like cool concepts like this that are easily like you can see built in, or maybe like similar to Karl Franz. I want to do a Boris bear blob, like sort of like flank overload with bear units and just completely crush my opponent on one side of the battlefield with this immense like they're like the symbol of Kislev, right, with these bears. And don't even get me talked about the elemental bear, which is just a terrible unit. But if you take any of these units in a competitive environment, you're just not going to win, and it sucks. I want to be able to do this. The power gap between light boar sleds and anything else is just awful. If I try to bring anything else, I'm putting myself at such a handicap. And that's one of the biggest reasons why I'm just not liking Warhammer 3. It's like, at least in Warhammer 2 meta, if I brought something that was a little less meta, I think a great example was Bone Giants. I loved Bone Giants for Tomb Kings and their niche applications, and things like that. You know, like bringing Tomb Guard. Tomb Guard were not very cost effective, but you can make a build centered around Tomb Guard and having sort of legions of undead defending skeletal archers and things like that. If I didn't bring the most competitive build, but it had a theme, it had a plan. I think a plan is a better way of stating it. Like I had a game plan. I may not be being the most optimal, but at least I have a powerful idea, and it can still beat very competitive players, if that makes sense. Like a lot of you may know I made vampire counts, and I still do. I think I'll play them a lot when they come back in Warhammer 3. But you have so many build options with vampire counts, even though their unit roster is relatively low. You can do some sort of mobility. It's called Blood Knights, undead dragons, flying air squads with the heroes, or you can do Vargheists that were buffed. You can do a ghost build, which is more thematic, but not very strong, but still fun. Or you could even do a Graveguard build supported by corpse carts, blob builds, because that's vampire counts, anything with like a Mortis engine, things like that. You can do, or Vargulfs, Terrorgeists. I can name several different builds for vampire counts. Well, I can't name a single different build for Kislev or Khorne. And for the factions that are really struggling, like Cathay and Nurgle, they don't really have a set build, except for maybe Cathay with their double Sentinel, because they're just so weak. They don't have that OP unit in their roster. Nurgle just doesn't have that OP unit, with the exception of the Exalted Great Unclean One with its Mortis engine, right? And Cathay has their Dragon Lords, and their Sentinels, and that's really about it. They don't have too much staying power. Their infantry is not great. The ranged is pretty hard to defend, and their air units are just not cost effective. So, yeah, there goes two of the factions out of the many factions that were released already just in the dirt. Can't really play them unless you want to win. But if you do win, you know you're a lot better than your opponent. It feels good. One of the main reasons I've joined XMT DBD is because of the sort of mentality that we play memes. We play it for fun, yes, but they're fun. But we play it because we enjoy feeling strong. We enjoy feeling better in a way. I always try to keep my my bad manners down. I always never boast about it, but the feeling of beating somebody with a faction that's still weaker has always made me feel great, and it gives me this endorphin rush, And it's so hard doing it with these factions that are just such below the power curve. Like, don't even get me started with Ogre Kingdoms, right? Gorgers. Like, once again, I go back to the point that the power gap between strong units and weak units are just huge. Gorgers. My goodness, Gorgers are so good. Iron Blasters, so good. And that stupid artillery piece, right? It just... God, they're so powerful. And if you take those away, the faction is, like, okay. Like, they're decent if you take away those tools. It's like... That's how powerful that every single unit is on every single roster. That just needs to... They really either need to nerf those really strong tools or buff everything that's not strong, so we have a much more even playing field. Like, meme units will always be meme units, and tactics will always be better than others. But I want to actually think about the builds or have a little fun with making my armies. Right now, all the skill in Warhammer is actually in the micro and the decision making on the battlefield. The decision making for builds and trying to make the builds is very mediocre. There's very few changes between matchups. And if the only thing you change in between matchups is to not necessarily adapt to the enemy's army, it's to like cheese an enemy's lack of tools. I think Slaanesh is a pretty good example of this. Slaanesh has the weakest air force in the game. That's not Kislev, because Kislev doesn't have an air force, but Slaanesh does not have ranged units. So Slaanesh has these Harpies that are AP, which are really good. The Furies with AP are very good cost effective wise. But if you face Tzeentch or Cathay, you can cheese them because they have such a small amount of tools with dealing with actually like mid to high tier flying units that you can put like a blimp in the sky. It's like one of the few matchup a blimp is actually good. It's versus Slaanesh. Or you can do these super sad double flying disc heroes or flying chariot and just cheese the Slaanesh player by sniping their lord, because they just don't have the tools to really fend off these flying units from Tzeentch or Cathay. And and even in some, I played a game with Taco as Nurgle in a 2v2, Nurgle versus Tzeentch. Nurgle versus Slaanesh, and I used the Death Heads, and Slaanesh just legitimately could not do anything, and they paid for themselves like double the times over as they just killed the Slaanesh Lord, and the Slaanesh player just could not do it, could do nothing about it, which is fun and interactive gameplay if you ask me. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic. So, lack of build variety, I think this can be fixed. Just make it so that the weaker units are either a little bit stronger or nerf the really obviously overpowered units so that we have a more even playing field. The low unit roster, that's a problem, but that can be fixed with DLCs, and I admit that just takes time. The only problem with low unit roster right now it made it so the multiplayer community really learned, like they learned how to play the factions extremely fast, which is one of the downsides of having a low unit roster. Like in Warhammer 2, the meta was ever evolving with different builds because of all the different unit roster, how high the unit roster is. Like High Elves, you have these Lothar and Seaguard, or maybe you just use normal archers. Empire was a great example. Lizardmen, do I use Chameleon Skinks now, or do I want to do some cool Saurus build, or do I want to do a cavalry rush with the cold ones? Even though that wasn't optimal, it was a fun plan, and it could work, But nowadays, you've got one build for every faction. It's not very enjoyable to try to play at the highest level. You just have to play it casually with friends, or just play against opponents that are not gunning to be the best to win over having fun. And obviously everyone's definition of having fun is very different. And if your definition of having fun is winning, my hats off to you. It's just not the same definition that I have. And I want to have more time thinking about my builds. I want to have more time thinking, not seeing the same build from my opponent every single time. And if they bring a different build, I don't want to stomp them. I still want to see the plan that they came up with, or the sort of theory crafting that they come with. Like, oh, I see your idea there. It just didn't work out because, maybe you're missing a tool or two, or maybe you need to still work on it. And I just want to see the strong units and the weak units have a much closer gap in terms of power level. So, thanks for listening. I know this is probably going to be my last Warhammer video for a while, until at least Immortal Empires. And if I post this video and Immortal Empires comes out tomorrow, and we can play the old factions in multiplayer, then that would be hilarious. But and I would go back to Warhammer immediately. I would try to build, try to theory craft builds. How does this faction work in domination now? Like, I was just watching people play High Elves in domination. It's cool. It's like, oh man, I can bring Phoenix Guard now. I can put them in the boxes, or I can think of so many different things now with domination and new factions being added, and how wide the variety is. But currently the demon factions, Kislev, Cathay, and Ogres, are just as bland as cardboard to me. And unfortunately, that's why I'm just not interested. So for those of you who are subscribed to me for just Warhammer content and things like that, I, first of all, thank you for staying if you haven't left yet, because, my channel's always been variety to some extent. I've played a lot of different games, World of Tanks, Code Vein, Hunt Showdown at some points, but Warhammer was always my focus, as you could say. Nowadays, it's much less so. But I hope you understand why I'm no longer going to Warhammer 3. And if you disagree, have fun. I don't want to stop you from having fun playing Warhammer. But I'm just not having that fun. So thank you for listening. This is Poison Ducky, and I hope you learn something, or you try to understand why a lot of the multiplayer community, or a lot of Extreme Meme Team, I want to say I can speak for them. I truly do. Extreme Meme Team, QSA, and a lot of different members, from people dropping off from Warhammer, why they're just not playing as much anymore. So yeah, thank you guys. Thanks a lot for sticking around, and I'll catch you guys later.